Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to completely strip away that cartoonish villainy so often associated with Niccolò Machiavelli's famous text. You know the vibe I'm talking about. Instead, we're reframing The Prince as what it really is, the original, hyper-pragmatic executive survival guide. If you've ever had to navigate extreme uncertainty or manage a really complex organizational crisis, you're going to find his methodology incredibly relevant.
Okay, let's take a quick look at our agenda. We're going to hit the Renaissance crisis grid, Machiavelli's systemic trauma, shattering the ideal utopia, the executive dilemma, Virtù versus Fortuna, and finally, wrap it up with the modern boardroom legacy.
Section 1. The Renaissance crisis grid. Navigating 16th century volatility.
So we have to start by looking at early 16th century Italy. And don't think of it as just some dusty historical backdrop. No, this was a highly volatile, completely fractured geopolitical market. At the time, Italy was driven by immense economic accumulation. But here's the kicker. It had absolutely zero unified defensive infrastructure. Because of this, it basically degenerated into a playground for foreign powers, right? France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, they all continuously executed mass plundering and drove constant economic chaos. Internally, you had these fractured city-states like Florence, Milan, Venice, and the Papal States, all operating under perpetual friction and dealing with rapid institutional coups. And to make matters even worse, Italian rulers relied heavily on condottieri. Basically, these were private military contractors and mercenary forces who had absolutely zero national alignment. They operated strictly for the money, meaning they just wanted to get paid without getting killed, and they routinely betrayed the very executives who hired them. Literally, it was a landscape of pure, unpredictable chaos.
Section 2. Machiavelli's systemic trauma, the fired executive.
Now, Machiavelli wasn't just some armchair philosopher. He actually spent 14 years as a senior diplomat and high-level strategist for the Florentine Republic, negotiating directly with kings and emperors. But then, in 1512, the Florentine Republic suffered a massive structural collapse, and the powerful Medici dynasty made a hostile return to executive governance. And the fallout for Machiavelli, it was absolute. He was stripped of all his assets, imprisoned under unverified conspiracy charges, and physically tortured. By 1513, he's forced into permanent rural exile. So when you look at The Prince, you gotta realize it wasn't written from a place of comfort. Born out of the trauma of losing his job and his standing, this book was actually a desperate tactical resume. It was explicitly designed to showcase his high-level technical competence for the new Medici regime, which is wildly ironic, right? Because they were the exact same people who had just finished torturing him.
Moving on to Section 3. Shattering the ideal utopia and shredding the old playbook.
To get his job back, Machiavelli had to completely disrupt the medieval governance manuals that came before him. Traditionally, these manuals were known as mirrors for princes, and they basically dictated that an ideal ruler had to personify deep Christian virtue, absolute benevolence, and pure idealism. But Machiavelli looked at the chaotic Italian market we were just talking about and realized something pretty blunt. Maintaining perfect moral purity among ruthless competitors basically guarantees failure. So he shocked the intellectual landscape by introducing the verità effettuale, the effective truth. He replaced imaginary utopian republics with a framework that analyzes political networks exactly as they function in practical execution, anchoring his theories entirely in raw historical data and human behavioral psychology. A real game changer.
Section 4. The executive dilemma, the operational mandate.
Let's see how this builds his taxonomy of state structures. We're going to focus particularly on the unique risk profiles of what he called new principalities. These are territories secured by independent innovators who face the monumental challenge of stabilizing authority over a highly suspicious, completely unaligned populace. For these leaders, Machiavelli outlines a very cold operational mandate. You must maintain the state at all costs. Your primary job is securing macro stability and public safety. If achieving that optimization requires breaking agreements or faking loyalty, well, you do it. Most notably, he argues that if cruelty is required, it must be swift and surgical. A highly compressed application of force prevents prolonged civil friction, which actually is what truly drains a state's resources over time.
I want you to think about your own leadership style for a second. In the middle of an intense market crisis, facing an unaligned and suspicious populace, what's your safest bet? As an executive, is it better to be loved or to be feared?
So how does Machiavelli answer this classic management query? Well, while optimizing both love and fear is obviously ideal, he notes that human nature is inherently volatile, ungrateful, and deceptive. Therefore, it is exponentially more secure to be feared.
He delivers this brutal truth anchored entirely in behavioral data. Love is a variable, right? It depends heavily on the emotions of your subordinates, who will readily withdraw their alignment at the first sign of a real market crisis. Fear, on the other hand, is anchored by the threat of punishment, a hard metric that you, the chief executive, directly control.
Now, hold on. This does not mean you have a blank check for tyranny. You have to carefully walk a very specific tightrope here. You can be feared, for sure, but you absolutely cannot be hated. Hatred breeds conspiracies and structural collapse. According to Machiavelli, you actively avoid hatred through one primary rule: strictly respecting your citizens' private assets. As he famously and rather darkly put it, men forget the death of their father more easily than the loss of their inheritance. You can punish a man, but you never touch his property.
Section 5. Virtù versus Fortuna, the ultimate asymmetric conflict.
How do all these executive decisions map onto the grand conflict that defines leadership? Machiavelli breaks this down into two opposing forces. The first is virtù, and right off the bat you have to strip away any Christian moral connotations of piety or goodness from this word. In Machiavelli's analytical matrix, virtue defines raw executive drive, tactical cunning, and pragmatic intellect. It's your strategic adaptability, your capacity to decode a shifting landscape. A leader with virtù knows exactly how to operate simultaneously as the lion, using raw force to dismantle threats, and as the fox, using astute cunning to identify and avoid systemic traps.
Opposing your virtue is fortuna. This framework captures the completely unpredictable forces of history. Think of it as macroeconomic volatility, black swan events, economic shocks, geopolitical storms, basically all the stuff that lies entirely outside of your direct human control. Machiavelli pragmatically concedes that fortuna governs about 50% of our success and failure. But that remaining 50%, that can be mastered and hedged by your virtue.
To really understand this dynamic, Machiavelli uses a brilliant metaphor here to show how a prepared leader actually survives. During times of market calm, a leader with virtù doesn't just sit back and relax. They construct protective dams and channels. They build infrastructure. They actively hedge against chance. Why? Because when the inevitable macroeconomic storm of fortuna hits, the river will flood. But if the infrastructure is pre-built, the sector might flood, sure, but the state itself survives. Basically, you use the calm to prepare for the storm.
Finally, Section 6, the modern boardroom legacy. From Florence to the MBA.
Let's look at how this exiled, tortured diplomat accidentally invented the core curriculum for today's highest-level leadership programs. By completely decoupling statecraft from religious morality and private ethics, Machiavelli established what we now call realpolitik, or political realism. He essentially converted the audit of power into an autonomous scientific discipline. Today, the operational mechanics of the prince are heavily analyzed within corporate executive programs and elite MBAs. His analytical methodology remains the definitive grid for managing extreme uncertainty, executing unpopular but vital decisions to protect organizational continuity, and running cold forensic audits of competitive landscapes and strategic alliances.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative thought to consider for your own operational mandates. Machiavelli showed us that the world is inherently volatile, and that hoping for ideal conditions is practically a blueprint for failure. So I have to ask you, how will you prepare your infrastructure before the floodwaters rise? When the next macroeconomic storm inevitably hits your organization, will you rely on idealized love or the strategic agility of virtù? Thank you for watching, and keep building those dams.